Good morning, Harris community, and thank you for joining us for Harris Reunion Weekend 2024. We're thrilled to have you at the Keller Center. My name is Nick Moore, and I'm on the Harris Alumni Relations and Development team. We have an exciting day of activities planned, starting with this session entitled Freedom of Expression and the Chicago Principles. It's my honor to introduce this session's presenter, Dean and Sidney Stein Professor, Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. Dean Bueno de Mesquita, a UChicago alumnus himself, joined the Harris faculty in 2007. I suspect that many of you have taken a class taught by him. A renowned scholar, Dean Bueno de Mesquita's research focuses on using game theory to analyze and understand national security, violent conflicts, electoral politics, and other related areas. Before being appointed dean last month, he served as deputy dean and interim dean at Harris. Please join me in welcoming Dean Ethan Bueno de Mesquita to the stage.
Hi. Good morning. The music was like a little energetic for a Saturday morning. I'm not going to be quite that energetic. Anyway, it's great to see so many people for Alumni Weekend. Excited to get to talk with you about this. I always start, some of you maybe were at dinner last night, but I always start when I'm with Harris alums by saying to any of you who were here in the kind of 2007 to 2010 range when I had just arrived that you have my apologies for my poor teaching. I worked really hard at it. It got better. So for those of you who had me when I first got here and didn't know what I was doing, I'm sorry. Okay, so I thought, with things going on campuses all over the country right now, and more generally talk of freedom of expression and speech on campus so much in the news, that it would be nice to spend a little bit of time talking about the Chicago tradition of academic freedom, freedom of expression, and the like, because I think that it's a defining part of this university. It is super relevant to the contemporary discussions we're having. And I think it's a part of the tradition of the University of Chicago that we at the university often kind of take for granted, both in the sense of it's the air we breathe and so or the water we swim in, and so we don't notice that we have it quite as much as we do when it's in the news. But also I think we often take as an assumption that our students and our alums have a deep understanding of the Chicago tradition, even though we didn't talk about it. And I don't know where that would come from. So I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some background on at least how I think about the Chicago tradition and what it means, and then talking a little bit about current events on campus, and hearing your thoughts and taking any questions. So that's the plan. So what I want to do, I guess what I'm going to start with is talking broadly about what I think of as the Chicago tradition. And I think often the Chicago tradition gets called just free expression or free speech. And I think that's a mistake. Although free speech was sort of the part of the Chicago tradition that got a ton of attention maybe over the last 10 years, especially during the presidency of Bob Zimmer, our immediate past president of the university. But I think the actual Chicago tradition of academic freedom or freedom of inquiry stands on a bunch of pillars, of which free speech is only one. So I want to talk through what some of those pillars are, which include academic freedom, the absence of orthodoxy, freedom of expression, toleration of offense, civil discourse, vigorous debate, the welcoming of protest and dissent, and very importantly, I guess, currently, institutional neutrality. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense from some of the founding documents, as well as the interpretations of some of the past presidents of the university about what that tradition might mean and what some of the arguments for that tradition are. I don't think everybody agrees on why we have that tradition or why we ought to, or even whether we ought to. And then I will turn to some current events. And I should say, here we are at the University of Chicago with the free expression or whatever. You should feel free to, if you have thoughts or questions as I'm going, just shout them out. Yes, you can interrupt me anytime. We run a seminar here, so I spent, until I became dean, spent all my time as a member of the political economy faculty. And in the political economy seminar, when speakers come, as they do weekly, we give them a little parting gift with a mug, which is, got the Harris brand on it on one side, and on the other side, what it says is, interruption is the sincerest form of flattery. So, okay. So let's talk about the Chicago tradition. I'm just going to give you a sense of what I think of as some of the fundamental principles of the Chicago tradition beyond just freedom of expression. We'll talk about freedom of expression too, with reference to these reports. So the Chicago tradition is really built on a textual foundation as well as sort of a shared culture. And the textual foundation is found in what, we talk about them romantically, but they are just a bunch of committee reports that either the president or the provost of the university tasked a group of faculty to write a report, and they kind of sat around and grudgingly did it, and then eventually submitted it, and then we got these founding documents in the way of committees. But we do have these very important committee reports that really have shaped the culture and the way we think and talk about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the principles embodied in those reports, and then give you a little sense of how those have been interpreted or justified by various presidents of the university. Okay. So what are the principles of free inquiry that underlie the Chicago tradition? I think first I'm going to talk about academic freedom. And so academic freedom, and here we have the Calvin report, which is maybe one of the two most celebrated of these reports. Academic freedom is, I'll read this quote, but the mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. And here I think we really have the kind of first-order Chicago idea that nothing is off the table, that we are in the business of discovering new knowledge, talking about new knowledge, disseminating new knowledge, and that if we're going to do that, we have to be able to ask any question, we have to be able to reach any answer that analysis and evidence points us towards, right? So there are no rules of the road other than ethical rules of the road. So, we have rules of the road about, say, experimentation on human subjects, because we're not monsters. But there's nothing that's beyond the pale. You can ask any question, you can investigate any topic, and you can talk about it freely. The second, and in some ways, I think, really actually the bedrock at this university, which is a differentiator from other universities that have a robust tradition of freedom of expression, is institutional neutrality and the absence of orthodoxies. And institutional neutrality has, I think, been a bit more in the news since the congressional hearings in the fall. And the idea of institutional neutrality, again, comes from the Calvin report. And this is from, the Calvin report is written in the late 60s. In the wake of a lot of controversy on campus around the Vietnam War, there is no mechanism by which the university can reach a collective position without inhibiting that full freedom of dissent on which it thrives. It cannot insist that all of its members favor a given view. The neutrality of the university as an institution arises then not from a lack of courage nor out of indifference. It arises out of respect for free inquiry and the fullest freedom for its faculty and its students as individuals. And so here the idea is that the university as a corporate body, either through sort of a collective statements or through statements of its leadership, doesn't take institutional positions on policy questions, on issues of the day, on societal questions, except in the rare instance that those policy or societal issues touch very directly on the work of the university. So if the United States government was planning on slashing the budget of the National Institutes of Health, which funds all of our medical research, the university would feel perfectly free to hire a lobbyist and go to DC and write op-eds and say, we think it is really important for the practice of science that the government continue to fund cancer research, right? That's the kind of exception. But the university is not going to take positions on issues like foreign policy or on questions of the right level of redistribution, or you get the idea. And the reason, as articulated in the Calvin report, is not indifference or that those of us in leadership don't have views on those things that are deeply felt or good arguments, but rather that, we might have good arguments, I don't know, but rather that we want to ensure the fullest freedom of the members of the university community to think and argue and come to their own views, and that there is a chilling effect that if the university states a position on foreign policy and you are a member of the student body or a member of the faculty who doesn't agree, one, you might feel chilled from saying your view because someone in power has said something else, but also because that person in power is presuming to speak for you, and it is not their place to speak for you. So institutional neutrality. And institutional neutrality has a pragmatics to it, which I think we've seen very much in the news of late, which is that a long tradition of institutional neutrality solves a lot of problems for university leaders. Because if you say in a principled way, the place for disagreement and opinion is in the individual member of the community, not in the corporate body, then when Congress comes to you and says, why haven't you taken a stand on this very important issue that I care about and I want to yell at you, you are justified and backed up by your history in saying, it's not my place to, I'm just the guy in the suit who runs the budget. Right? The people who have opinions at the university are the students and the faculty who are here to debate and explore ideas, and my job is to keep the place running. I don't get to tell them what to think. Okay, freedom of expression is I think, perhaps the most obvious of them, and it is the one that was really emphasized here until very recently by Bob Zimmer's commitment to the sort of Chicago tradition. The one he was most concerned about was freedom of expression. The idea here is simply as follows. So this is from the report of the Committee on Freedom of Expression, which was a committee chaired by former provost and our colleague at the law school, Jeff Stone, during the Zimmer presidency, except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of the university community to discuss any problem that presents itself. And this is really the idea that in the broad public sphere of the university, you can say anything you want. You can think anything you want, and you can say anything you want, up to, of course, there's a couple restrictions. One is the functioning of the university. Okay? So what does that mean? That means you don't, for example, have full freedom of expression in class. You can't go to your physics class and insist on talking about politics because you have freedom of expression. And you can't go to your politics class and insist on talking about physics either, right? Because there's a thing going on there, which is the core work of the university, which is teaching and learning. And you cannot, your freedom of expression rights don't extend to disturbing that practice, right? It's very important to learn physics in physics class. And you don't have freedom of expression to talk about politics there. Your physics instructor is perfectly entitled to say, you need to be quiet, we're talking about physics, right? That's one exception. The other exception, of course, is more or less all the exceptions defined under First Amendment jurisprudence, right? So I think more or less the position of this university is in the broad public sphere of the university, so I say out on the quads, you can say anything you want if that thing is legal under the United States Constitution. So there are things that are not allowed to be said under the United States Constitution. You can't directly threaten another individual. You can't incite violence, right? You can insult people. You can say very, very offensive things. You ought not, but you can, right? And the position of the university is, if it's allowed under the First Amendment, more or less, I don't speak for the university. My interpretation of the position of the university is more or less, if you can say it under the Constitution, you can say it on the quads. We don't encourage you to say all the things that you're allowed to say under the Constitution on the quads. It's an extremely bad thing to do, right? There's lots of things you're allowed to say under the Constitution you ought never say, but you can. And the reason is because we don't want to be in the way of people exploring ideas, saying edgy things, exploring the outer boundaries of thought. Okay? The next two are kind of, in some sense, the flip side and reciprocal implication of all of this, and they don't get nearly enough discussion. Okay? So from the report of the Committee of Freedom of Expression is about toleration of offense, civil discourse, and vigorous debate. Debate may not be suppressed because the ideas are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments and to act not by seeking to suppress speech, by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas. So this is the one, this is the sort of the underlying underpinnings of freedom of expression, which is more or less like the sticker, the bumper sticker version of it is, right? The right answer to offensive speech is good speech, or the right answer to a bad argument is a good argument, right? So the idea here is why do we have freedom of expression? Because we want to counter speech with speech, and along with that means a couple things. Okay, along with that means, one, we have to learn to tolerate being offended. We're going to be offended by things people say, and we have to hold dear the distinction which John Stuart Mill makes between offense and harm. Right? That is a distinction that I think Bob Zimmer in particular was particularly concerned with because he saw it being eroded in the discourse in society. That to say that when I am offended, I am harmed, to blur that distinction is, at least in the Chicago tradition, a mistake. We want to say there are lots of things which offend us, which don't harm us in the sense of rising to the level of an incitement to violence, that we might want to say is banned, say, under the First Amendment. Right? So there's this harm-offense distinction that I think is very important inside the Chicago tradition. But at the same time, there's a flip side of that, which is we ought to endeavor to speak to one another in a manner which is consistent with the lofty goal of the exploration of ideas and the arrival at truth and all of that, epistemic high-mindedness. Which is to say, if we're going to speak freely and explore ideas for the purpose of seeking truth and new knowledge and all of that, we ought to try and speak in a way that not only doesn't harm one another, but doesn't offend one another as best we can. We should speak in a way that invites conversation. We should listen in a way that invites conversation, right? We should listen in a way that gives charitable interpretations to the things people say that we disagree with. And we should speak in a way that tries to empathize with people who might disagree with us and invite them to conversation rather than push them away. That's a hard set of skills. It's a thing we're thinking about a lot here. I'll talk a little more about that. But part of it is we have to tolerate offense, and the other is, we should be civil people, and we should listen charitably, and we should speak kindly. And I think we often don't emphasize that as much as maybe we should. And the last one, and super relevant today, and almost never talked about when we talk about the Chicago tradition, although President Alvisados' letter invoked it this week, which is the welcoming of protest and dissent. So this is from the Strauss Report, another of the founding documents of the Chicago tradition. And here we really, in addition to institutional neutrality, we see another differentiator, even from other campuses that welcome free speech. The University of Chicago has a tradition not only of welcoming free speech, but of genuinely welcoming protest and dissent. Okay? So here's the Strauss Report. Dissent and protest are integral to the life of the university. Dissent and protest should be affirmatively welcomed, not merely tolerated. The passionate expression of non-conforming ideas is both a cause and an effect of the intellectual climate that defines this university in particular. But maintaining this kind of university community imposes obligations of mutual respect on everyone involved. University administrators have a responsibility to act with restraint and flexibility and not to insist on the enforcement of rules for their own sake. People engaged in protest and demonstration have reciprocal obligations of respect and constructive engagement. They have a responsibility not to jeopardize the university's ability to meet its commitments and obligations. There's a lot there, but I think I want to pull out a few things. One is protest and dissent are a rich and important part of the tradition and are to be embraced. Right? They are not to be viewed with fear. They are not to be viewed as antithetical. They are part of what we do. Right? Because we explore edgy ideas, and sometimes that leads to deeply felt convictions. Two, we have lots of rules around protest and dissent, as we have to maintain the functioning of the university, but we ought not apply those in a bright line strictures kind of way, right? We university leaders ought to bend over backwards to accommodate speech, dissent, and protest, right? When they threaten the functioning of the university, we have to do something. But even if rules are being broken a little bit, that doesn't mean we have to right away enforce the rules and end the protest, because protest and speech in and of themselves are constituent of the university. And so we can be, as we should be, not can be, should be, as flexible as we possibly can in accommodating protest and dissent, even up to tolerating rule breaking, as long as that rule breaking does not threaten the functioning of the university or the ability of others to speak. And third, protesters themselves should be civil and productive as best they are able. That the point here is, in fact, the exchange of ideas, and we all have obligations to another as best we can control ourselves to be civil and productive. I think that's the sort of the protest tradition. So those are what I take to be sort of from the founding documents, the key sort of features of the Chicago tradition. To remind you, right? So academic freedom, we can ask anything. Institutional neutrality, the university and its leaders don't take positions. Free expression, we can say what we like, right? Toleration of offense and civil discourse. That we keep this distinction between harm and offense, but we also try to speak in a manner that invites conversation. And welcoming of protest and dissent as a legitimate part of the tradition of free expression. There are, of course, exceptions. I'm not going to go into detail, but the important exception is all of this is subject to the constraint of the proper functioning of the university and doing its important work, which is the discovery and dissemination of information. That is to say, it is research and it is teaching, right? So we have this robust tradition of free expression, of academic freedom, of protest and dissent, but none of that can be allowed to, in a deep way, infringe on the work we are doing here, which is learning new things, teaching students. That is the work of the university, and all of this is in service of that. Okay. Let me just quickly say, why do we have this tradition? Like, we have this tradition. Why do we have this tradition? I actually think we don't all agree on why we have this tradition. We don't all agree that we should have this tradition, first of all. We do, but we don't all agree that we should. We definitely don't all agree on why. And let me just illustrate that by pointing to 4 presidents of the university, all of whom were deeply committed to this tradition, but provide at least 3 different rationales for it. Okay? So William Rainey Harper, who's the founding president of the university, basically says, why do we have this tradition? We have this tradition because it's our tradition. Right? Like, you could have a different tradition, then you would be Harvard University. We're the University of Chicago, and this is what we do. It's also why we're called the Maroons. Why are we called the Maroons? And we called the Maroons, right? So Harper says the principle of complete freedom of speech on all subjects has from the beginning been regarded as fundamental to the University of Chicago, right? Why do we have it? Because like we came here, we're like, we know what we're going to be. We're going to be the people who speak freely. Now here we are speaking freely. That's not to be clear, I don't think like that's an absurd position. Like, universities have traditions which define them and which, right, speak to their niche in the culture, in the market, in whatever. And it doesn't have to be that because you believe your tradition is the right one for you that you think that that means that every university should have the same one, right? So I think we are the place like this, and there's other places like other things is a reasonable kind of view. Robert Maynard Hutchins, who I think is sort of obviously one of the 2 most important presidents in the history of the University of Chicago, and then different people, you can choose your own second of those 2, but nobody, I think, would say that Hutchins isn't one of the 2, really makes kind of the opposite argument, or at least the opposite conclusion. So Hutchins really comes at it from this kind of high-minded epistemic, like, we're here to pursue knowledge, and the way you pursue knowledge is by asking and talking about anything. So Hutchins says, the free and independent exercise of the intelligent is the means by which truth may be discovered. And therefore, we must have the free exchange of ideas. So for Hutchins, unlike Harper, who I think is really a kind of like, it's our culture, Hutchins is saying any university worth its name would have the Chicago tradition. And if you don't have the Chicago tradition, then you're not really serious about the pursuit of knowledge. Very different view, right? Kind of a view rooted in an epistemic understanding of how one pursues knowledge. And finally, Hannah Gray, who was the president when I was an undergrad here, towards the end of her presidency when I was an undergrad here, and Bob Zimmer take related views, which is that really the tradition comes out of the teaching mission. So what Hannah Gray says is education should not be intended to make people comfortable. It is meant to make them think. Universities should be expected to provide the conditions within which hard thought and therefore strong disagreement, independent judgment, and the questioning of stubborn assumptions can flourish. So for Hannah Gray and for Zimmer, who this is from a famous op-ed he wrote during his presidency, students learn not only through the acquisition of specific knowledge, but also through the attainment of intellectual skills that serve them in their entire lives. One word summarizes the process by which universities impart these skills: questioning. Productive and informed questioning involves challenging assumptions, arguments, and conclusions. Essential to this process is an environment that promotes free expression and the open exchange of ideas, ensuring that difficult questions are asked and that diverse and challenging perspectives are considered. For both of them, there's this fundamental thing which is about the harm-offense distinction. They want to say, if you're going to learn new stuff when you get to a university, that is going to involve you discovering that things that you think are true, things that you care a lot about, might be wrong. It certainly entails entertaining that possibility and hearing from people who think that you are wrong about things you care very deeply about. Otherwise, what are we doing here? And if we are going to do that, that means we have to be prepared to be extremely uncomfortable, in particular in the classroom. And if we're going to be prepared to be extremely uncomfortable in the classroom, one, we have to have the harm the harm offense distinction. And two, we actually have to speak freely. This is the thing that Zimmer was most concerned about. Zimmer was concerned not with that we had a tradition of censoriousness in the sense of university officials were punishing people for speech. He was concerned no one was saying what they thought, that we were all self-censoring so much that we were losing the opportunity to learn that there were people who didn't think like us. That was the thing he really wanted to push back against and why he really emphasized free expression so much in his presidency. Okay, I'm almost out of time, so I'm gonna skip over some of the details here. Let me say just one word about the Harris. Rena says I'm okay. Let me say one word about what we're doing at Harris. So my own view of this is I like the Chicago tradition quite a bit. My view of this is related to the Zimmer point and related, I think, to the events of the day. The principles which underlie the Chicago tradition seem to me, I agree with Hutchins, the foundation of a university worthy of its name. That is, I do think we should be able to ask anything. I do think that we should be talking about difficult ideas and having hard conversations. And I think that the assurance that you are at a place that has your back when you do so, and the building of a culture that says it is okay to question orthodoxies, it is okay to ask questions that feel uncomfortable, that's very important. But I think it is woefully insufficient to the task on its own, right? It's a foundation, but it is not the whole thing. And I think the main thing that we're kind of missing in our culture, we're still missing at the university to some substantial extent, is the actual ability to have hard conversations and the actual desire to do so. So we know that we're allowed to. We know the university has our back if we choose to, but we are often choosing not to. That is the self-censorship problem. And let me just be clear, lots of self-censorship is good. The thing about how there's lots of things you're allowed to say under the First Amendment that you should not say, that's self-censorship. Thank God, right? Like, we want lots of self-censorship. All of us think things we ought not say out loud, okay? But self-censorship that is, I have a thing I really want to say. I think it might be true. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts, but I'm worried if I say it, I'm going to be judged. That's really bad at a university. That's thing one. Thing two is I think we have not developed sufficiently, and if we wanted to be shallow, we could blame Twitter, the skills of both what I think of as productive speech and empathetic or charitable listening. That is to say, we have a little bit gotten away from when we hear somebody say something that we think is really wrong or even outrageous, asking ourselves, what is the most charitable interpretation I could give? What might a person of goodwill who said that thing have in the back of their head? Let me assume they think that, at least for the purpose of conversation, to see if I can learn something from them. Yeah? And at the same time, when I think something and I go to say it, how might I speak in such a way that a person who disagrees with me would hear an invitation to conversation rather than hear grandstanding and a pushing away? Those are difficult skills, and they require practice and thought. And I think while we have talked a lot about the principles, we have not talked nearly enough about learning to do that and becoming a community of people who actually speak empathetically, listen charitably, and don't self-censor. And so we are sort of working hard on this now at Harris. We last year sort of launched a beginning of building a conversation around the Chicago principles. Starting next year, we're going to really build some programming around this idea of civil discourse, of listening charitably, of speaking empathetically, of trying not to self-censor. And that's going to be a years-long project for us. But we really want to try and help lead on campus and in the social conversation around what does it mean to get back to not just saying that civil discourse is allowed, but to doing civil discourse civilly. So that's more to come, but we're working hard on that. All right, let me just say a word about the current moment, because here we are in the current moment. All of this has become super relevant, especially on university campuses in the last few months, and especially in the last couple weeks. So I'll just tell you, for those of you who haven't seen, so President elucidates has sent out 2 letters to the university community in the last week with respect to ongoing protests and counter-protests concerning the war in Gaza and the encampment on the quads, which if you haven't gone to see, I kind of encourage you to go see it. And here's the view he took, which I think is highly consistent with the Chicago principles, and the view he articulated, especially in his first letter. One, consistent with the Strauss report, the university is going to give the greatest leeway possible to free expression, including the toleration of the breaking of some rules, as long as the breaking of those rules does not disrupt the university's functioning from its core tasks. And that's the first thing he articulated is there are rules already being broken. The encampment is a breaking of the rules. You are not allowed to erect a structure on campus without prior approval. You are not allowed to sleep on the quads. There's counter-protest signs that were registered have been torn down. Rules have been broken. No question that rules have been broken. And there's accountability for that. Okay, so when rules are broken, there's an administrative procedure that goes through a very long process of adjudication. And the students who have broken rules have been informed. There could be consequences for you, as there would be if you broke rules in some other way. Right? If you had a food fight at the dining hall, there'd be consequences too. But that doesn't mean you got to take down the encampment immediately. Like, you can tolerate some rule breaking because we care about the speech and the protest and the dissent. Two, all of this is content neutral without regard to who agrees with what position, whether people are offended by any of the signs, whether people are offended by the counter-protest signs. All of that is simply irrelevant to the decision-making of the administration of the university. And I think if you read the president's letter, you will see it is a letter which says nothing really about the present moment other than here's how it applies here. Like, it is not about this issue. The idea is everything that has been said in those reports and everything that is said in those letters would be applied to any protest on campus. Right? We are neutral with respect to content. We are neutral with respect to offense. Accountability for rule violation I already talked about. Intervention, consistent with this idea of the greatest leeway possible. Intervention as a last resort. And what is the decision criterion for intervention? The decision criterion for intervention is the work of the university. Right? If the rule breaking becomes sufficiently severe that the university cannot do its teaching work or the university cannot do its research work, then an intervention is justified, right? That's always been the standard. That remains the standard. There's some subtlety there that I think is worth noting. So some of the rule breaking has passed this line, and this is sort of outlined in the second letter. So there has been some protests during hours when amplified protests during hours when amplified protest is not allowed that has disrupted classes on the quads, right? So people can't hear in class because of amplified activity. That is in the way. There has been some vandalization and blocking of buildings. That also is in the way of the university doing work. And then there's a subtlety, and this is like a gray area, but the presence of the encampment itself over time imposes costs and burdens on the university that make other functions harder. So the deans on call have to be available and out there 24 hours a day because there's a large group of students and protesters and counter-protesters, and somebody has to be there to make sure that everybody is safe, everybody is, close enough to following the rules, et cetera. The university police have to be out there because there are students sleeping outside on the quads, and the university has a duty of care to the safety of the students and the safety of the campus. When the university police have to be on the quads 24 hours a day, they are pulled away from other tasks, they are working overtime. There are strains on the functioning of the university that come simply from the presence, and I think one thing that's indicated in the president's second letter is the duration itself can become a disruption, and in the second letter, the president articulated that from his point of view, we have reached the point of disruption, which is not to say that the encampment has been taken down, but a direct request has been made for disbandment on the grounds that the work of the university is being disrupted. And the last point that the president has made in his emails is to say protest is one form of letting people understand your ideas, et cetera. There are others, and a kind of encouragement to discourse, debate, the use of reason, et cetera. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk a little bit.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thanks so much. I work with undergraduate students a lot, and I feel like you can talk about these principles in sort of the ideal, but you really need buy-in from students, and particularly the undergraduate students who, are very young, as we all once were, and very volatile, and particularly when you're coming to this tradition from the world that doesn't always encourage this type of tradition. So if students are already coming in with sort of either not thinking about this or actively thinking the opposite, like how do you actually empower undergraduate students in particular to care or at least engage with something like this?
Yeah, so this relates back to, I think I agree it's especially true for 18-year-olds, but I think it's true for all of us. I think we all live in a culture where this stuff is hard, and we could use some skill building and practice and et cetera, right? So it's one of the things, as I said, we're trying to think about here is like, what would a series of experiences and engagements look like that helped us all start asking? I just think like you can learn to sort of have the reaction like when you're about to say a thing to ask yourself like, what would somebody who disagrees with me hear? And is there any way I can say what I think and rephrase it a little bit so that they could hear what I say instead of hearing something that tells them to go away or makes them want to yell at me? And the same thing with listening. I've had this experience a lot in the last few weeks talking to a lot of students with the, hey, I hear that you heard that sign or you heard that speech in a manner that felt deeply discriminatory to you or hateful to you. Can we think about what a person of goodwill who said that might, like, could we imagine a person of goodwill who said that saying it, right? And what would be in their head? So I don't have like, I don't like, who knows, right? Like there's a long, like I think, but I very strongly feel like the University of Chicago, the next step for the University of Chicago, if we want to continue to be leaders on this, is cracking that nut. Like I think we need to be, yes, I think, I think, yeah, so I think that you can model it in the classroom. And I think we do actually. I think we're good at it in the classroom. But I actually think the classroom is the place where it's easiest because the classroom is so artificial. You like pick these intellectual topics and then you tie it, and there's a whole framework and whatever. It's way harder in the wild, right? And so I actually think like we should be doing things, we're going to do things that are not curricular but are co-curricular, that are really about, and I think it starts with one-on-one conversation. So I think it starts with let's talk about some skills, some very basic skills, just the habit of charity, right? And then one of the biggest problems, and this is why I sort of jokingly alluded to Twitter, but I think one of the biggest problems in encouraging civil discourse is when you are speaking to a person, but you're actually speaking to a whole different audience of people who agree with you and who you don't want to, right? Like that's, I think, a not trivial part of the problem. I think protests are like that. Social media is like that. A lot of life is like that now. And so I think it starts with sort of saying, let's talk about some simple skills, and then let's put ourselves in one-on-one situations where we are in the business of discovering some disagreement and talking through it. And just start doing that for a while and see let's notice that actually there's something really meaningful and great about discovering that you disagree with somebody about something, and it's for good reasons, not bad reasons. It's not because they're a cartoon villain. It's because they have different life experiences than you, or slightly different values than you, or think a different thing about how the world works than you. So, but I think that happens at least the easiest place to make that happen is in a one-on-one conversation. And I think we jump way too quickly to group conversation. So at least that's my beginning thought. But we're going to be experimenting with it, and yeah.
Do you think a university's financial investments can affect its ability to be a neutral institution? And do you think these principles have anything to say about how a university would handle its endowment?
I do. And let me be clear that I'm speaking for myself, not for the university. So I think that financial investments affect the world, and lots of things we do affect the world, right? My view, and I share this view, I think, with the president, is that were we to start making financial decisions for reasons that reflect our politics or a particular view of an end state we want in some political issue, we would be taking an institutional position on that political question. And that would be a violation of the Calvin principle. Now, no matter what you do, you got to do something, and you're having an effect on the world, right? But I think the right principle then for thinking about investments of the university's endowment is, what is the purpose of the endowment? The purpose of the endowment is to support the research and teaching mission of the university. And so the sort of the teleology of an endowment with that purpose is to be as big as possible. Right? Like, we want as many resources as possible to support what we believe is a genuinely important research and teaching mission, which is the fundamental work of this university. And so I think our obligation with respect to the endowment is to not think about politics when we do it, but rather to turn to professional investment advisors and say, we would like the best, risk-adjusted return on our endowment as possible to support the research and teaching mission of the university. And if we think certain investments, not we the university, but people, think that certain investments are immoral, are contrary to the interests of society or whatever, the right mechanism for changing the university's investments is public policy. That is, the United States Congress can change the university's optimal investment decisions by saying, you know what, there's certain countries or certain industries or whatever that are contrary to the interests of the United States, and there's sanctions against them. And then the university would change its investment strategy, not for political reasons, but because we are trying to maximize our support for the research and teaching mission. And if our society thinks certain investments are immoral, that should run through the law. And then the university will change its behavior because the law has made that the thing to do given the mission of the endowment. That's at least how I think about it. It's a hard set of issues, but to me, that's the answer, at least, that feels consistent with institutional neutrality.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. My question goes to, you've talked a lot about the definition of offense and how the university perceives that. You mentioned harm. Will you explain the definition of harm? I'm curious, is that just physical? Because there are other definitions about injury, reputational damage, and also just systems of oppression and how that harms specific groups of people.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, right. Like, conceptually, the harm offense distinction is a very beautiful one that really clarifies everything right up until you try and write down a definition, at which point the whole thing becomes impossible. So yes, there's a giant gray area where reasonable people are going to disagree on where harm starts and offense ends. And I think that is, I don't have an answer. Nobody has a solution to that problem. I think in a society at large, the answer to that problem is we decide it by voting. And at a university, somebody's got to make a decision about where the line is drawn. And it's really, really hard because, of course, people of ill will always walk right up to whatever line you say and stick their toe over it. So that said, for me, it definitely does not end at physical harm. Physical harm is the obvious, easy case that everybody agrees is harm. It definitely doesn't end there. So there's no question that targeted harassment at a person aimed at damaging their reputation or making them scared, like an individual scared, that's harmful and not allowed. And that's consistent with the First Amendment jurisprudence as well. The places where it becomes, I think, trickier and let me say, I think there's other clear cases where other universities don't agree that they're clear cases, but I think they're clear cases for Chicago, which is generalized offensive language. So I think that generalized offensive language on the quads is just clearly allowed. And I agree that generalized offensive language can, in some instances, support and maintain systems of oppression. I just agree, and I think that is we have decided to live with that in exchange for free expression, and that's there's trade-offs, and that's the trade-off we've made. And here, I guess I'm a little bit on the Harper side to say, I don't think you have to make that trade-off to be a university worthy of your name. And I would point here actually to former dean of the Harris School, who's now the president of Vanderbilt, who is also deeply committed to academic freedom and institutional neutrality, but has taken a much stronger line on offensive speech and said, no, we're a place with free expression and academic freedom and all of that, but we are also a place where there is just a cultural expectation of civility, and I'm not going to stand for it. And you are not going to use deeply offensive language on the quad. We're not. So, and I think Vanderbilt is a university worthy of its name. So, so I don't actually think you have to by the Chicago, or at least what I take to be the Chicago line. I don't know what the current president would say exactly on this question, but what I take to be the Chicago line, which is the First Amendment really is what we mean. I think you could be a university worthy of its name and push that line a fair bit. But I do think like there's what I think Zimmer thought was there's a slippery slope, and that we start, like you think about the famous Safe Spaces letter or whatever that went out from the university. Not my favorite letter in the world, but I think like it was a reaction to a perception of a slippery slope that as we go down that path, there's always going to be a pushing of the boundary of harm versus offense, and at some point we've really lost the thing. So I don't have like a tight definition. I think we do kind of tend to fall back on like more or less what the First Amendment means is what we mean, and I do think that comes with real costs that I lament, but I think there is a trade-off there in terms of drawing bright lines. That's not like a totally satisfactory answer, but at least since John Stuart Mill, nobody has people have been trying to answer where that line is and failing, so I'm going to fail too.
Hello. So I actually don't know the answer to this question at all, so it might be a moot point. But when you were talking about what the university does with its endowment, does the university invest in other things that people might find controversial, like weapons or gambling or any of those others? And if they don't, how do they, I guess, explain this advice to the professional investors, given that for something that's on a more national level, we just want to follow national policy?
So let me say a few things. The deans have nothing to do with the investments of the. Every once in a while I sit next to the chief financial officer at a dinner, and that's everything I know about how we invest our endowment. My uninformed sense is like when people say the university is invested in things that like the university has for sure got lots of its money simply in like say the S&P 500. And the S&P 500 includes weapons manufacturers. It includes fossil fuel companies. It includes, big tech companies that run social. There's lots of things that just in the course of investing, even your own, say, retirement accounts, you are investing in lots of things that you or others may find objectionable. And so that's one thing. Now, university endowments are invested like complicated hedge/private equity funds, and I have no idea what we hold. We hold all manner of God knows what. But I am sure there's plenty of things in there that somebody would find offensive. Do we have one more? I guess so. That might be right as regards to the way it was described. Although the statement on protest and dissent is a little nuanced. But if I think about the way President Olivisatos has approached this, I think what he has said is we are going to bend over backwards to accommodate speech, even up to rule breaking, and also the rules are the rules. And so, and here's how I think he's threaded that needle, to my mind, very beautifully, which is you're breaking the rules. That doesn't mean I need to pull you off the quads, but I have informed you you're breaking the rules, and I have informed you that there's accountability for that. There is going to be a consequence. I don't know if it'll be a punishment. There is going to be a consequence. I am submitting this in the normal manner to university disciplinary procedures for rule breaking. So I don't think they have not said any rule breaking is without consequence or accountability. They've said rule breaking is subject to consequence accountability. That consequence does not have to be immediate removal from the quads. There's lots of rule breaking that doesn't get you get informed like that wasn't allowed, and it's going to be referred to the process, and now go on with class, right? Like there's lots of things like that, and I think what's happened is to say like you are both breaking the rules and you are speaking, so we're going to let you continue speaking because speaking is very important here, and also we're letting you know you've broken the rules, and that comes with consequences. So I actually think that seems like not giving up on the rules to me. It's just saying not every rule violation is a crisis, and so requires immediate response. All right. Thank you all.